The talk today is we're going to talk about two technologies and kind of how they combine together to help developers and designers be more in sync and build better products. So those two technologies are Storybook and Figma. So I'll start talking about Storybook and then we'll switch over to Figma. I'll just first kind of give just a quick intro to Storybook. For those of you that have never heard of Storybook or maybe have used it just a little bit, it's essentially an open source tool to develop UI components in isolation. So a lot of times when we develop React applications, there's components that get thrown into other components that then get thrown into other components, and sometimes things in order to reach one component, you kind of have to go through this entire user flow in order to test it out. So Storybook allows you to test every component that you have in isolation by itself, and that way you can kind of reach these kind of hard to get edge cases and kind of combinations of states that might not be as easy to replicate inside the actual application that you're building. So Storybook is framework agnostic, which means that it's not just for React. It's actually works nicely, or it integrates with React Native, Vue, Angular, Ember, and I guess Svelte. So pretty much it integrates with everything. It is the cool thing about Storybook is that you can kind of get a bird's eye view of your entire component library, which you don't really get once your application gets big enough and you have enough components. When you're trying to build a new piece of the application, you don't really know if the component that you're trying to build, maybe there's pieces of it that already exist in the code base, and it's really hard to kind of see it unless you can like search through your kind of component tree and actually visualize what those things look like. So Storybook provides you some nice UIs where you can say that you have to build some sort of date picker, or I guess it's a bad example. Maybe you have to build some sort of form that uses a lot of like strange inputs. You can kind of search and see, okay, is this input already in my code base, or do I have to actually go and build it from scratch? And Storybook kind of gives you some nice tools to kind of search through your stuff and be able to quickly kind of visually check, instead of maybe you search through your code base and you see that there's a component called, date picker, but you don't know what it looks like. You just see that code there, and you have to kind of go through this whole UI flow to actually visualize it. So it's good for reusability. It makes it easy for a developer to check whether something exists or not. And the final thing about Storybook is it has an ecosystem of add-ons that is growing every day. So there's kind of all these ways to supercharge your Storybook tool set to add new functionality to it. And one of those add-ons we're going to talk about is the design add-on, which actually combines Figma into Storybook, which gives us a very powerful tool. So we'll switch over to that in a second. So yeah, that was a little bit about Storybook. Billy, I'll let you kind of do a quick run through of Figma in the context of this. So,
yeah. So Figma is a multiplayer, and I would say multiplayer is like multiple people can be in a single file at one time across the internet. Product design tool, prototype tool, and really a place where developers can get information like hex codes, padding amounts, and everything like that. It's really taken things like Sketch, InVision prototyping, and Zeppelin and mashed them all together into a single tool that allows anyone to be in your file at any time. So your prototype is using the same elements that you're actually designing, so you're no longer cutting out a single screen to put into InVision. Everything's live, so you update it live. People can jump in your files, leave comments, and it's really, really dynamic and it's really flexible. And it allows people to build really intricate design systems that inherit things across from multiple files, all in a really nice tool set that's web-based, which is like one of the biggest positive sides of Figma is that anyone can jump onto it. So one of the things is like when the whole industry was using Sketch for a while, if you ever had a client that was using a Windows machine, they couldn't get in your Sketch files. You had to send them an InVision link, but now they can just jump into Figma. They can check out your prototype, leave comments, everything like that. So if you are interested in Figma, how many people have used Figma before? Okay, we have quite a few people in here. So if you haven't used it, we do have a, Wisconsin UX has a three-part series, just kind of going through the introduction of what is Figma, how to use it, how to put things together and run a prototype in there. So if you want, check that out. We have that on our YouTube channel. So
cool. All right, so so we're gonna start with just kind of the basic setup of Storybook in a simple React app, and we'll see how Figma integrates with Storybook later. So I'm kind of gonna do a quick run through of Storybook in the text editor. So for those of you that came to the last React.js meetup, we actually built a simple to-do list using Glitch. So what I have here is a project that I'm gonna run here for you all to see what the app is. So I'm just gonna do yarn start. And that's gonna fire up the project. So this will be familiar to the ones of you that were here before. This is a simple to-do list built in React where I can just go ahead and add, a to-do list and delete it. You get the point. What I'm gonna do is kind of incorporate Storybook into this React app. So just to give a quick kind of walkthrough of, for those of you that have experience with React, this is pretty much a, create React app application. So I just ran create React app and threw a few components in here. I broke it out into several components like we did in our walkthrough. So we have, for example, our to-do component. We have our title. So just to give you an idea, this would be our title component. Our to-do would be this component right here. So it's all broken out by component. So in order to add Storybook to this project, it's very simple. I'm going to open up a new terminal here. And what I would have to run is, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with npx. It's a npm package like executor. So I can run packages without actually downloading them to my machine. So to run Storybook, I just specified the Storybook package, which is at storybook/CLI, and then I do Storybook init. So I actually already ran this, so I'm not going to run it here, but this is all you need. You run this in the top level of your app, and what will happen is Storybook will generate this folder .storybook, and it will have these two files in it. And after this gets generated, I can go ahead and just open up Storybook. So I'm going to do yarn Storybook to start up the Storybook server. And here Webpack is doing some compiling of what it's going to show us. And this is what Storybook looks like. So right now, we don't have any stories yet, but this is what Storybook is this kind of UI tool where we will be able to see each of our components individually kind of in their own little box. And we'll be able to manipulate them in different ways. So right now it says no preview, we don't have any stories, right? So, so for Storybook, let's go ahead and add our first story. So the reason why I have each component in a folder with its same name is so that I can throw the component story in that same folder with it. So I'm going to do the form input one. So the form input component is just this input here when I'm typing. So I'm going to go over to the form input, and I'm going to create a new file called form input input.stories.js. So now we have a stories file that is associated with the form input. Well, it's not yet associated in there, but how do we associate it? So we essentially have to use Storybook's API, which I'm going to show right now. So we essentially have to use, it's called the Stories of API. So I'm going to just quickly show you how it works. So the first thing is we import React, and we're going to import the stories of function, stories of, from Storybook React. So when we actually run that SB init, Storybook automatically figures out what kind of application we have. So if this were a Vue app, Storybook would have installed the Storybook Vue package in our app. It knew that it was React, so we would access the Storybook React package. I'm going to import into here our form input component, which is the one we want to generate a story for. So I'm going to do form input from form input, right? It's in the same file. Okay, so, oops. So how do we actually use this function to create a story of this form input component? This is how we do it. We just do stories of, and we do the actual name. So this is the name that's going to go up on Storybook, form input. That's the first argument. The second argument is our node module. This is kind of boilerplate here. The important part is this. When I do .add, and here's where we add our story. The first argument is kind of the state of our form input. So I'm just going to call it default, and you'll see in a second what that means. And here is where we actually render our form input component. So I'm going to do form input. And our form input component, if we check it out, it actually takes some props here, right? So we can't just generate it without props because some of these things are going to fail. It takes the input value, which is what value is actually in the form, and it takes the function that sets that input value. So for now, I'm going to create some kind of fake data or Storybook data that I'm going to pass into this component. So what I'm going to do is simply I'm going to create some props. So I'm going to call it default props. And those props are going to be those two functions, those two values. The first is the input value, which I'm going to leave as empty. And the set input value function, I'm going to have it be just an empty function. And then these props are what are going to go in here. So I'm going to use the spread operator to actually spread those props in here. Okay, so this is essentially, we have now created a story for our form input component with this state. So it has no text in it, and the set input value function, which is the function that happens when you type into the input, it just does nothing. So I'm going to save this here. And when we go back to Storybook, we see that we now have one story under the form input component that is the default state. So we're now seeing essentially like a cutout of that specific component in this state, right? So this is not super interesting, but we can add multiple states to see the same component in a different condition. So I'm going to show quickly here. I'm going to add a second state to this same story. So this is the default state, but I could add a populated state. So I'm going to create some props called populated props, or yeah, we can call it when there's actually data in there. So populated props. And the input value, instead of being empty, is just going to say, walk dog. And all I have to do is just add a new story. So I'm going to tack on another add to this stories of function. So I'm going to put it right here. We can actually break this up probably a little bit like this. So we have add, and this one's going to be populated. And the component I'm rendering is that same form input. Oops. But instead of the default props, we're going to do the populated props. So I'm going to grab this and put it in here. All right. Likes it like that better. So, dot add. Yeah, it should be like this. Oh, I see. So let's see. Let's try to put this like this. Okay, this one closes this one. And this one closes this one. There we go. I think that should be good. There we go. OK. So all that work, and now we have another state of our component, right? So we have the default state and then the populated state. So obviously, this is a very simple example, but you can imagine how you could feed all the different types of props that your component would need. You can have kind of a case for each, a state for each case of your component. So in this case, it's a simple input, so it only takes one prop that actually matters in this case. But you can imagine a component where, say, you need to visualize some data, or it somehow utilizes the props that you're feeding it to render other components. So that's the kind of stuff that you can kind of mock with this. So so now that we've kind of gone over like a simple example, I'm going to switch over to a branch where I've already added kind of all the stories to our component. Yep. You have a question? This module here? Yeah. So this is a this stories of function. This API just utilizes this. It's a node. It's a built-in variable to the environment. So it's not defined here. It's just it's like a global variable. It's a reference to the Storybook module, I believe. So actually, this API, this Stories of API, they're actually changing it to get rid of that module. So there's a new API called the CRF for Storybook. It's called the Component Reference. I have it right here. It's called the CSF, which is the component story format, which uses exports. Instead of having this stories of function, you would just export the stories from these files. And Storybook kind of knows that if you're exporting something from a .stories file, it kind of replaces this kind of awkward module way of doing it, because this is not very beginner friendly. It's like, what is that variable, right? But luckily we have VS Code here with some TypeScript or some. It gives us an idea. It's a node module type of variable that is just, yeah. I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's just
Magic global.
It's a magic global that it's kind of a backdoor for Storybook to actually pull its own package in here and do what it needs to do. So let's see. So I'm going to switch over. So I actually have another branch here where I'm going to, I have the all stories branch. Let's see. So this is what the Storybook looks like when I've already put in here kind of one story for each component. So the first one is our form. So this is a component that combines the input and the button. This is when it has text populated. We have our form button by itself, form input, text populated, this is the one we did. Title. So each of these is an individual component. This is a to-do, and this is our to-do list. So you can see how kind of allows you to kind of showcase your whole application. And actually, Storybook is used a lot by like UI frameworks as just their documentation. So we use a lot of like graphing libraries where their documentation is just a link to their Storybook. So you can just look at what everything looks like in Storybook instead of them having to build it out in some like, essentially recreate what Storybook does. So this is kind of just the basic idea. I'm going to talk a little bit about this Storybook folder here that I didn't really go over. So I'm going to comment some of this out for a second. The main idea of this file is this is where you actually determine which are the stories you want to include. What it does is it parses your directory for files that end in .stories.js. And then, again, there's some module magic here. But this is actually something that you don't actually write. This is just a file that gets generated for you. But some of the things that we can do is we can kind of do a little bit of customization of this kind of this preloading of all of our files. The small demo that I had here was just setting the background of Storybook as a kind of a quick way to show you like the kind of stuff you can do. So you can create a theme by importing the theming, or by importing the create function from the Storybook theming package, and then you can just use that function to create a new Storybook theme. In this case, all I'm doing is the app content background. I'm changing it to blue, and then I'm adding some parameters. This is another function, add parameters, where I pass in that theme as an option. And if I save this, we reload, we see that we kind of have overridden some things here in Storybook. So there's a lot more than just the background. That was just a quick example, but we can change a lot of different things of how we can use it. I'm gonna kind of stop here with Storybook, and we'll switch over to some kind of, now that we have this tool, how do we actually use, or like, how do we, as a developer, what should I look for from a designer in order to organize my components using your design tools? So
yeah, so Nico's going to switch over to Figma, and he's going to follow along with me.
yes.
Okay. So this is kind of one of the cool things about the multiplayer aspect about Figma is when you're presenting, I can drive, he can follow along, and I can kind of walk him through it. But when it comes to setting up your Figma file to be conducive to integrating with Storybook, there are some, I don't want to say best practices, but some things that we found that work out really well. We follow sort of the atomic design principle, and that's kind of how we structure our files. And I'll kind of go through each one of those. This is a very simple file. It's a to-do list. So I have the design prototype along with the entire UI kit all in a single document here. A lot of times that won't necessarily be the case. So if Nico wants to, actually, he can play. So we did make a little prototype.
Go ahead. Do you want to
play there?
right here?
Of the to-do list app. And this is kind of using one of their new features is the Smart Animate. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to use that yet. I'm going to just drive real quick.
Go ahead.
So one thing that we, allowing the Smart Animate allows you to add a lot of unique animations to your prototype. So this is kind of a neat thing, not necessarily Storybook related, but kind of allows us to do nice little transitional animations that they didn't allow before. So I just wanted to kind of show that off. So if I delete this one out, I can have things move up and slide down. You can fake somebody out and say, I have a real app, and it's really just a prototype. So let's exit out of the prototype and just go back to your other view.
Just close it?
Yeah, you can just close the prototype and then go there. And you should still be following me.
Yep.
One thing they don't allow you to do, if you click the prototype button, all your followers don't follow along with. So sort of setting up an atomic design file, one of the ways that we'll set things up is we break things down into particles, atoms, molecules, and organisms. Particles are a lot of our super high level elements that don't necessarily need to be brought into Storybook. This would be colors. If you're doing any plates or rounded corner elements, shadows, stuff like that, we would store those in here. So we have a plate element here so we can control all our rounding elements, and then our type styles. This stuff doesn't necessarily need to be integrated in there, but that's kind of what we've extrapolated these out to their own level. These normally would go into atoms, but we've sort of, since we might have multiple products using a single particle file, we'll kind of pull those out at like a level higher. Then the secondary level here is atoms. So atoms are a lot of like single elements. So here we'll have containers. So these containers will be using the plate file to inherit their shape properties. So if I round the corners on that plate, it's going to change all the rounded corners here. And then there might be slight modifications here. So a stroke for a secondary container or an empty state, and then a fill for a primary. We would put our icons in here if they're not in their own file that we're pulling in, but icons might live in here. And then this is kind of a shortcut, but I put all the templates into a single frame here. So one thing that Figma does that I believe Sketch does it now too, is if you put things into the frame, you will see that it will separate everything real nice based on the frame that it's in. So then you'll see these in the asset browser here. So just kind of a nice way to organize things instead of doing button /.
I don't think that's being displayed over here though.
Oh, yep.
It is?
Yeah, you can't see that.
Do you want me to show it?
Yeah, if you want to go to here,
you can just drive.
So if I open up, oh no, that's right, your view only mode.
Okay,
Trust me, it's really great. But this template file would be the template that drives all our buttons on the system, the template that drives all the row elements in this design system, and the template that drives the input field here. The reason we break out the templates ahead of time is that we'll make modifications or the different states in the molecule area. So this is the part where these would probably be what your development team would grab and put into Storybook, because here is where you're going to define out your different states. So like here, I just have two submit buttons that say submit, but I might name this one normal, and this one active. I've same thing with submit row. This might be like normal, and this might be like hover state. And these would be the frames that would be being pulled into Storybook, and you would put all your different states in here. And these would be the components that you would normally drive all your prototypes and designs with. These are still pretty much the simpler versions of components. So like a button in different states, row in different states, input in different states, icon placement container. So if you're doing dense for like mobile apps or normal for like web apps, you might have that here. And then here we just have a page header. And then in organisms is where we would start to put our more complicated components. So this is our form, which is a lockup of our input field, and then the primary button, which now says normal, or normal button. And if I switch this out, I can switch out the different states real easily in sort of these complicated components. So really when organizing your files is really paramount to getting them into Storybook, and you might have to work with your dev team to really think about how are they organizing things, how are you organizing things. Normally they would be coming into Figma and maybe looking at things here, but here we're really going to leverage, they don't have to go into Figma because they'll be getting a lot of that information out into Storybook itself. Another thing that with Atomic Design might be templates, and these are like full page views. Don't have that in here because it's such a simple app, but those might not live in this file. Those could be in their own file depending on like what kind of product you're building. So you could have like a sign up file template file or something like that. So yeah, so I think that's it for just like the general Figma overview and structure. And now we can actually get some things plugged in.
Okay.
And change them around.
Cool, yeah, so as Billy said, the molecules is kind of at the level where as a developer, that's kind of the horizontal where I would go in and grab the stuff that I'm gonna be putting in my, well, the molecules and organisms are kind of the two places. Because in Storybook, like you wouldn't want to like have a mock-up of like your entire application, right? Like there's a level where things are complex enough where you're like, okay, this is the cutoff. I'm not gonna have a story for, maybe if you have a complicated app, like I'm not gonna have a story for the entire sidebar that has all these crazy configurations. I'll have a story for each line perhaps, right? So the molecules and organisms is where I went to reference some of the things that I needed for my application. So I'm going to switch back here to our code editor, and I'm going to take a quick look at, so I already added some design, and I'll kind of walk you through what I did. So the first thing that I did was I added the design add-on to Storybook. So from what we have, all that I did was just the following. I just did yarn add, and the package is Storybook design, Storybook add-ons, and then design. So I've already done this. The capital D flag is for development, so this will be a development dependency, so it won't go into production. But this package allows me to add design to these stories. So I already ran this, so I'm not going to run it. The next thing that I did after I did that is in my add-ons, I added this line. So these two lines come with when I first install Storybook. This third line, you can see that it's the register package from the Storybook add-on design. So this kind of like superpowers my Storybook instance where I can now reference this specific add-on. What it does is I'll show you right here. For example, in the story for our to-do, it looks a little bit different than before. The only thing that I added is this third object here, which is kind of the add-on object in Storybook. And what I'm the key here is design, and I'm referencing Figma, and then I'm passing a URL. Okay, so it's just an object, an options object, where I say, okay, use the design package, use type Figma, and then the URL of a specific Figma node. And that URL would be, in this case, I'm using this URL, which is, this is the frame, right?
Yeah, so if you
called?
have a frame selected and you hit share, you
Right
can
here,
grab
share.
the URL to a specific frame. And so that'll be the URL that you want to use. I know the web browser does switch, but sometimes it's not as nuanced as grabbing the actual share and grabbing link to a specific frame.
So this is the link I'm using there. And if I go back here, well, in that case, so this is the to-do, so I'm actually using this one, right? The rows one. And what does that look like in Storybook? You can see now that if I go to my to-do, there's a design tab here, which comes when you install that design add-on. And when I click on it, it's going to actually render Figma inside of Storybook, where I can go ahead and zoom in, move it around. And essentially, I immediately can see exactly what the design team expects this component to look like, right? So this is, as a developer who has to constantly go into Figma and kind of scour through looking for the specific thing that I need it to look like, this is super helpful because I just go in here and I can just immediately do an eye check. Okay, that looks right, right? This kind of matches. And we'll see form input, same thing. I can just immediately quickly do an eye check here. Okay, that's when it's empty and when it's filled, right? So even though this is kind of a simple implementation, when your app is big enough, this is incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful because it kind of puts all the things that you need to look at in the same place, both from the developer perspective, when you are doing this entire user flow to get to a specific state of a specific component, then check it going into Figma to find that specific thing. Here we can just, both things are right here, super easy to check, easy to look at all in one screen. So that's kind of the idea. So not only do I see kind of the most up-to-date, but this is actually live. So if Billy were to go into inputs and actually change something, that would actually, I can see it live as he types it, right? So it's very cool. We're always going to get the latest version of this, and it's using all of his design patterns and his design system. So
yeah, so it's leveraging Figma's live embed, which if you've ever plugged in their thing into Notion, or it gives you essentially a live view of their entire website. Since Figma is web-based, that's what they're using. And do you have the buttons in there?
yes.
So one kind of neat thing is, so to get as great as Figma is, and it's great to get developers in there clicking around the prototype to get some stuff in there, there's different things that you can do to sort of communicate things to your development team if they're using Storybook, so they don't even have to get into Figma. Things that like, so here, I cheated because I made this earlier. Things like adding padding guides or margin guides or communicating different features in your design system, they'll see those right away as they're being added so that they know, because like in Storybook, I don't think you can actually go into Figma and see sort of the padding elements like you could if you were in the CSS or the code view, but you can communicate that with some nice nuanced overlays. They explain like how things are set up, different elements, what type, you know, this is using the input font, and different rules. You can communicate those in the frame itself. So there's really a big, there's a really good reason to make sure that everything's in a nice frame, nice and clean, organized and documented, so somebody in Storybook can get in there and it's not just a bunch of stuff floating around in space. So.
Yep.
How do you communicate between design developers on like the animations? So like when you hover over that, how do you
You mean like
Just like
the animation, like the kind of the milliseconds to fade in and stuff like that?
CSS animations and stuff like that.
That's a good question. I mean, we usually I think that decision happens early in the project where like I guess I'm not sure. We usually have a when we build out a component system, these types of things are the first things that get built out. And usually design is pretty closely involved in those first few components that are gonna kind of set the base for the entire project. So that's really not something that we use this for. This is more for those kind of intermediate components that have multiple of these atoms where the animation of those we could use using some of Figma's prototyping, but this is more for just kind of a visual check. The animations usually are something that is talked about outside of Storybook, I would say.
Figma's like their smart animation system is nice. It's still pretty limited compared to using something like Principle or even in Vision Studio that allowed you to set is it an ease in, ease out, allow you to move some of those parameters, actually set specific second amounts. I want this to ease in for this many seconds and then come out of that. So like it's not that advanced yet. So if we really needed to communicate a lot of like very specific animation stuff, we may still jump back to a tool like that or find an example out there that exists. It's like, this is exactly what we want. There's plenty of CSS animation libraries that we can reference and look at. So hopefully they add it soon. And then we'll just have another tool, another part of this tool that, so we don't have to go into another piece of software. So
yeah, usually if a designer doesn't specify, most developers don't really add any animations. I do, but most don't, right?
yeah.
So let's see. So yeah, that's kind of you know, one of the things I wanted to kind of discuss here today is kind of ask all of you, like, first, have you all used Storybook before? And for those of you that haven't, what is your process right now for doing some of these things that we're talking about? I just kind of wanted to open it up for whoever has just wants to kind of give their input on this, because for us, it really does solve some problems when it comes to kind of building things that are constantly changing, which happens a lot when you have clients that their expectations and the things that they need are constantly changing. You might look at Figma one day and you're like, okay, you take a mental picture and then you go and build it, but then you go back and it's like, oh, it's not what it looks like now. I swear that 2 days ago it was different. This kind of helps you get that latest and greatest constantly as you're building. So yeah, so for those of you that don't use Storybook, do you have an alternative system, or do you, who here has used Storybook or uses Storybook right now? Does anybody? Nobody uses it? What do you guys think of the system and like the integration with Figma? Does it? Yeah.
I have a quick question. So I've done development, use Figma, but I primarily do design. Figma is really nice because it has like some of the generated code, whether it's exactly what you would actually write or if it's just a helper.
Yeah.
Does Storybook do any sort of assistance for you to generate the codes, the code for those buttons to basically streamline that process for you?
No, but I mean, to be fair, the generated code in Figma it's not real. I think it's like, for people who don't know code, it's like a nice add-on, like, oh, it generates code, but like developers look at it and like, it's not useful. It's like CSS, and sometimes it's accurate, but the CSS is like kind of the cherry on top of. It's not really the component.
It's great when a designer has to build a website because it's like copy, paste, done.
So yeah, but that's a good point. I think the day that Figma turns into code is the day that I don't have a job anymore. So hopefully that never happens. But but I think that piece, that CSS piece, does not get translated into here. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's on purpose. It seems like this kind of this Figma API that they're using here is kind of purposely simple. Like it's they don't really bring much. Like you can't even edit or move things around. It's almost like as a developer, they don't really want you to touch or move things around. So I'm not sure if leaving that CSS piece. You can always click right here and it'll take you to that actual frame, which is like pretty useful, right? So I have it right here, the CSS code. But I think that they exclude that on purpose just to keep it uncluttered. That would be my guess.
I think I forget the exact tool we use or dev stuff. It's a similar UI kit. I don't think it's exactly Storybook, but yeah, I mean, I like how it abstracts all the components and ties it with Figma, and it gives you that kind of quick link. Because right now, I don't think we have currently in our workflow. But, you know, it's like it's a matter of them remembering the link that I sent them, which
Right.
half the time they don't remember.
Yeah.
So it's nice that it's just right there.
There's a cool design system management tool out there. It's a little more robust that you can put live code, your Figma prototypes in. It's called Zero Height, I believe, but it's like documentation, Figma assets, live code. It's more, I don't know, like we have a design system and it needs to be followed to 100% to the T, and here's all the notes behind it and the history of everything, which is web-based, which is pretty cool to, if you're looking for something to help manage that as well.
What is it that you're actually seeing in Figma when you're doing the design? Is it like vector artwork, like an Illustrator or something, or is it web components that are rendered in HTML on the screen and then it's sending it over as a preview to Storybook?
I mean, the editor is all presented as vector components. So like everything in there can be turned into a shape if it's type, otherwise as a vector component. There's people who've done entire vector illustrators in Figma. It's not built to do that, but it can do that. I don't know what it's written in though.
I'm pretty sure that like it's just one. Yeah, I've looked into this. It's really impressive. I think it's all what is it called? I wish it doesn't let me inspect it, but I haven't like looked into it too much. But it's a I think it is like SVGs or hold on, let me see if I can. Yeah, they just don't let you like inspect it. I mean, I can go in here and inspect it, but I was actually reading a. Oh, Billy, do you want to check the comments? I was going to tell you. I was reading an article about how Figma does their multiplayer. It's kind of like a quasi-distributed system to do it. Where is the? Jeez, over here. I usually just right-click. There we go. Yeah, let's take a quick peek in here. Yeah, so it's just a canvas, which is the word I was looking for. Yeah, so it's just, who knows?
It's actually writing code in there. It's not code for React, it's just super basic style code, essentially.
Yeah.
It's not HTML, it's Canvas, so it's using graphic UIs to write into the Canvas to draw its own with its own
Right.
library and JavaScript.
So, right. So the canvas tag is everything in there is written, as you said, using some sort of graph. You know, you can draw, you can put anything in there and animate it, and using JavaScript. And it, yeah, I'm not exactly sure, like how they I mean, this must be a decision in order to be able to be compatible with like building all this stuff out, like kind of I don't even know, like what you were talking about, the vector components. It must just be a better way to do it than like using pure React, is what I assume. But yeah.
Do have one question from the chat. It said, also one thing, not really shown, but assuming you can do it, but can you specify canvas constraints that the component is getting rendered on so you can do media-based layouts and verify overflow, etc.? I believe that if you want to go back to Storybook, I believe the clip canvas works.
Storybook.
Since it's just grabbing the frame. So like if I move this off, the actual clip canvas works. But any of the, and if I turn this off, I think as long as it's still in the frame, it'll still be able to go on the outside. So if you're doing like, let's say notes that are outside your frame for like a design system. So this button I just moved out of the frame, so it's no longer visible. But if I bring it back into the frame, even though it's above it, if you want to zoom up, so you can have things float outside of your frame, but still be in the layer. So you could have like some notes, a status of a design. So this could be like, use this button, but this could be like approved. And then we could have a bunch of notes down below to communicate things. We actually have a reusable library that we built out called our design system management system. It's not a very good name for it, but it has different statuses and notes and frames. Yeah, the DSMS. MS.
So meta.
DSMS. That we can place, and it has a bunch of stuff that can float outside of the frame, so we can change statuses and leave notes and communicate different things using the clip canvas on and off. It gets a little interesting when you have a prototype and you have clip canvas turned off and you have like a modal show up and then it says like approved above the top. So, but
cool.
I hope that answers your question, Blake.
Do we have any more questions from the chat?
Oh, I was referring more to media query-based layouts, so overflowing long tests and verifying that happens inside of a button.
Let me see. Media query-based layouts, so overflowing long text and verifying that happens.
I don't think they can really communicate that.
So I think like media queries, like having the media queries, I assume like if we were to like, how do we actually test for a smaller component? Or like if we want to show this component in a different state, you can actually wrap your component. So say like in your story, you could create a test media query wrapper that has a max width of whatever, and then you go ahead and render that instead of the to-do. So you would put the to-do inside of that one, and that's how you would test like a state of, in a limited width environment. And then the Figma part is just, there would be, if that was needed, there would be a design for that. So
yeah, we'd probably put that documentation right in there on the screen, different padding amounts, how things would adjust. We've done a project before where we had to do, it was like 4 different iOS or iPhone sizes, screen sizes. So we had to like document how everything adjusted and shifted accordingly.
Right.
So we did that manually because they didn't quite have the constraints in the actual components at that point. They had a little bit, but they didn't have like my favorite left and right and top and bottom. So, but.
Awesome. Well, any questions?
Any other add-ons that you would suggest for Storybook?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few cool ones. I was gonna show some of these. So before I dive into that, I just wanna, like if you just wanna learn about Storybook, learn storybook.com. It talks about what Billy touched on today, which is kind of how do we as developers interface with design systems. So this is kind of the, in the context of Storybook, how do we do that? And there's some visual testing handbooks. Well, this is not out yet, but there's in the design systems they kind of talk about how to organize your storybook, because you're going to be writing the storybooks as a developer. How do you kind of organize it, thinking of these design systems yourself? So, and it kind of just walks you through. As I said, there are a couple of different APIs out there to actually implement Storybook. We looked at the stories of API. There is a newer one that I mentioned, the CSF one, which I believe is going to kind of be the new version. But right now it's not universal yet, so it doesn't actually work in all of the different frameworks. So this is kind of the way that we can keep it so that whatever it is that you use, this will work for you. And this is still going to be supported, of course. But as for add-ons, the design one is really, I would say, the most powerful one that I've seen. Storybook. I was looking at some last week. There's another piece that we didn't talk about, which are the Storybook actions, which is not an add-on, but it's like a built-in thing where by toggling an action, you could, for example, change a Boolean in one of the props. So I'll show you. So there's an actions tab here that I didn't put anything in here, but you could define different actions, and here we would see some switches that you can turn on and off that would, for example, show what to do when it's completed versus not completed. And you could do that from the same story without having to generate, a million different stories. If you want to kind of compile some of those stories into a couple of, 2 or 3 that have some toggles that can show you the different combinations. That's a good way to test some edge cases, right? Where you can kind of have a bunch of conditions that you can turn on and off and check all the different permutations of that. So that's not an add-on, that's built in. But as for add-ons, I mean, you can go in here and kind of look at some of the stuff. You can actually build your own add-ons as well. So that's something that I definitely want to look into. But there's a cool add-on for, like they call them knobs, where you can map a numerical value, say from 0 to 10, and as you move the knob, that specific prop or value increases. So there's kind of things like that. There's actions where, say that you submit a form, you can get like a little notification inside of Storybook saying like this actually worked based on the conditions you had. Let's see. I mean, there's kind of I guess there's some more layers of conditionals that they call backgrounds, code snapshots with jest. So these are just more advanced uses, but this is a viewport one, right? So this is what we're talking about. So instead of building your custom wrapper where you, like you can imagine having actions to switch from mobile to desktop where the Boolean that you flip reduces the wrapper's width to kind of simulate you being on a specific device. This plugin seems like it does it out of the box. So it's so there's a bunch. There's some more. So these are the official ones from Storybook, and there's the community ones. These are probably the most popular ones. Some internationalization ones if you use React International. Yeah, so feel free to kind of dive into this and take a look at some of the cool ones. This is the one that we are using, the Figma one. So, yeah.
How are your Storybook files being managed alongside your project? Is it like intermingled with your project code, or is it like its own separate project alongside of your?
Yeah, that's a good question. We actually have them intermingled. So the pattern that I use here is what we are currently using in the project that I'm working on. We have a folder with the component name, and then in that same folder, we just throw that component story. The reason for that is, the component tree is already big enough that having another component tree that we have to keep in sync with the real one would be really difficult. So instead, we just decided to just keep one component tree and just have the stories be alongside the components. Because you can imagine if you move something from one place to another, if you forget to move the story, then suddenly your story tree is like, you might as well just throw them all in a folder, right? So that's kind of what works best for us. Do we have any other questions? If not, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you all for coming. We'll be sending out some more resources, some of the things that have worked for us to get us up to speed on kind of some of these cool features of Storybook.
We
And
recorded everything as well, so it'll be up later.
Yep.
If anyone wants to watch it and go back.
like and subscribe.
All the YouTube things.
Yeah, it'll be up. So yeah, we will send that stuff out, and I just want to say again, this React.js effort, and I'm not sure for Wisconsin UX, but this, what we're trying to do is to have this be a community-driven meetup. So we want to encourage whoever, if you want to come up here and give a talk on whatever it is that you're working on, as long as it's React adjacent, or we can be lenient with that. We want to welcome you to just reach out to us, to me or to Jacob, and we can help you get there if you have something that you want to share with the whole meetup. We're looking for people who want to come up here. We don't want it to be kind of Headway doing it every month. We want it to be kind of organic and everybody contributing so that we can get other perspectives besides kind of the stuff that we do here. So.
And same thing with Wisconsin UX. If someone wants to talk about Sketch, that'd be great. I know we only talk about Figma, so, but like,
you won't be there.
Yeah. You never know. It could be like the best thing tomorrow, and then we're all going to switch again. That's just the way of the world, right? So, no, but we definitely want to get more designers and UX professionals to come up, give some talks, or even students, just to see what other people are doing, and just like help build a community that share as much knowledge as possible. So reach out. We can host it here, or we can go somewhere else. Or if you know someone who has a talk and they'd be interested in us talking with them or something like that, let us know too. This is our first like collaborative talk, but I definitely could see more of these in the future. So
Awesome. Thank you.